Thank you all for being here today. My name is Chris Steinkamp, and I'm the Executive Director at Mountain Towns 2030. And I really appreciate your time today for this amazing conversation that we're going to have with the Western Water Assessment crew. For those of you who don't know Western Water Assessment, they're based out of Boulder, here in Boulder at CU. They'll kind of dig in deep into their introductions and a little more detail into who they are and what they do in a second. But I just want to introduce Nels Bjarke, Katie Clifford, and Seth Ahrens. They are the team that we've been working with at the Western Water Assessment. And today we're very lucky to have them online because we're going to be talking about the current risk, community-specific assessments, and information about how Western Water Assessment can work with communities to build more resilience to wildfire risk, which I know is incredibly important, especially this time of year. So it's a really timely conversation, really important conversation to have, and we really I can't thank the Western Water Assessment team enough for being here today, and thank you all for being here. So they're going to take you through a short presentation, maybe about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So let's get started. Nels, do you want to just take it away?
Sounds great.
Thank you.
So you can see, let's see, are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, we're all set.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, my name is Nels Bjarke. I'm a hydrologist at the Western Water Assessment. And I'm kicking off this presentation thinking about wildfire risk, and then my colleague Katie Clifford and Seth Ahrens are here to provide additional information about kind of the social science component and thinking about how we build resilience as communities, and we'll be kind of lending our expertise to think about how Western Water Assessment and Mountain Towns 2030 can build an effective partnership for resilience building. So to start things off, I'll do a quick intro into who we are at Western Water Assessment. We are a university-based research organization that works in the space of hazards and adaptation and building resilience to those hazards. These are the 3 states, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, that are in our Western Water region. And again, we are based out of the university at CU Boulder. I also want to say at this point, we have a deep history of working within this region and have many community partnerships in this region. But we also are really looking forward to working more with different communities across the Mountain Towns 2030 network, because we truly believe that we can build resilience through community networks, and this is kind of one of the best ways for us to approach this question of resilience building. So a little bit about us. Our approach to partnerships. So we are a research organization, but we are a little bit different than maybe some of the other kind of more traditional research kind of science-focused organizations. We do provide usable science research, and we develop that through a process of co-production. But we also focus on research integration. So thinking about how our partner communities can use either existing research or might need new research developed by us, and really focusing on individual local community needs. We provide climate and hazard information, but we also have a deep set of experience convening and doing capacity building, which Katie will talk about a little bit later, which helps us to kind of leverage the physical science assessments and social science literature to really build our way to the most effective action for resilience for things like wildfire. And how we do our work, we start our work with relationships and engaging with partners to understand local knowledge of local needs to make local decisions. So we're really focused at that local scale. And the reason that we're hosting this webinar today is because we've heard from many of our community partners across our region that wildfire is a hazard that people are really concerned about. And obviously, recent events across the Western U.S. have just amplified that over the last several years. It's also at this point that I really want to, make a nod to how important the work that we think that Mountain Towns 2030 is doing in the mitigation space. And we really appreciate all of the work building that community to make these commitments to kind of mitigating our climate impact. And at the Western Water Assessment, we really believe that we can kind of leverage our work in resilience and adaptation to support climate mitigation as well. So it's a partnership that we're really looking forward to. So now I'll give a little bit of a background to the kind of West-wide wildfire hazards before I get into some more community-specific assessment approaches. And then I'll, after that, pass things on to Katie to think about the next steps of resilience building. Through this presentation, we are going to use kind of this string of approaches for building resilience. This comes from the Climate Resiliency Toolkit. So obviously the first step is getting started, and maybe that's what we're doing here today. We're getting started. I know many of you are already working on wildfire resilience, so maybe just getting started within our partnership and thinking about how we can really provide the best possible information for resilience building. I'll be focusing my part of the talk on kind of understanding exposure and assessing vulnerability risk. And then Katie will be thinking about the kind of social vulnerability risk, and then the kind of final steps of investigating options, prioritizing, planning. And then finally, we really hope that within this partnership and our work at Western Water, we can get communities towards taking action. So a little history. In the Western Water region, specifically, we've had about nearly 6,000 fires of reasonable size over the last 40 years. This comes from a data set from the U.S. Forest Service. And in that time, the area that is burned each year has been steadily increasing. So thinking this vertical axis here is the burned area of all fires across the Western US. You can see there's a little bit of a bimodal distribution where some years you have low fire compared to the kind of high fire years, but both of those sets of years, so low fire and high fire years, seem to be getting more severe where more acres are burning. Something I also always like to point out in this figure, just for folks' interest, you'll notice this really high point in 1988. These were the Yellowstone fires that occurred across that national park. And as you can see, essentially in the last 40 years, the greatest amount of areas burned. So you do have these anomaly years, and we really hope that through some of this process, we can avoid having some of these anomaly years impact our communities as severely. So a little bit about what factors amplify wildfire risk. There are a number of different components. Meteorology, as we all know, these hot, dry, windy days, these red flag days are the ones we dread most in the Western US. You hear the wind blowing and you feel the heat and you think, gosh, I hope nothing sparks anywhere close to me. Drought, obviously, the kind of drying of the land surface. So thinking about dry soils, dry vegetation, low flow in the rivers, this can amplify our risk for wildfire. Fuel load's an incredibly important component of it. So you need vegetation there to burn for a wildfire. And obviously the ignition events. So things like natural ignition through lightning, man-made, human-induced ignition, either through over celebration potentially through fireworks, or power lines downing have been a common cause of wildfire ignition across the Western US. And all of these things fall on a spectrum, thinking from environmental factors to behavioral factors, and fuel loads kind of fall somewhere in the nexus between those two things, because there's a management and a natural environmental component. So some of the questions we might be asking is, in this moment, how are these changing, and how are those adding to the kind of anxiety that very real anxiety communities are feeling about wildfire risk? So the most obvious one that I'll start with is drought. Across the kind of entirety of the Western US, drought has been getting more severe. This is an analysis that I've done as part of a project that we work on, Western Water Assessment, understanding how climate change influences the severity of drought. And over the last 70 or so years, What this figure is showing is that the severity of these drought estimated through precipitation and evapotranspiration, they've been getting worse year over year. And this has really led us to the current situation we're in, or at least in part, contributed to why many of our major reservoirs are quite low in the 21st century. So a picture here of Lake Mead, kind of historic low levels. And you can ask Seth at maybe the end of this talk about his most recent river trip and what his experience of the river was. But this is something that these drought conditions, this dry land surface really amplifies some of our wildfire risk across the Western US. Other factors. So from a meteorological perspective, what does the kind of historical and future of hot, dry, windy weather look like? So this is an analysis that I've conducted using historical data and some kind of higher resolution future climate model projections, looking at severe fire weather days. So this HDWI is just the hot, dry, windy index. Any value above 9 is a day where we consider fire weather to be somewhat severe. And in the historical period, we get, about 2 to 4 of these days every month, kind of climatologically. And in the near future, so these green bars, we expect about a 50 to 75% increase in the frequency of those days that are more kind of severe, more risk across the Western US kind of broadly. And then in the kind of far future, so thinking about a 50-year time horizon, this can increase by up to 2 to 3 times in the summer months. So some months having, a third of the days being essentially high fire risk weather. And this is actually a great kind of way to point to some of the converging goals of Mountain Towns 2030 and Western Water Assessment, where we, for the Western Water Assessment, believe that adaptation and resilience building is like incredibly important to deal with some of the current impacts we're seeing. And from a climate mitigation perspective, obviously we want to try to avoid some of these high emission kind of far future scenarios where we have to kind of then further adapt and build further resilience. Finally, I'll talk about the fuel loads and ignition events kind of jointly, and that's really because these are much more locally variable and in some cases really policy specific. So fuel loads, they depend on geography, so what kind of ecology you have in your region, previous burn history. One of the components of this is fire suppression and thinking about where landscapes have burned and where those fuels have been reduced through previous fires. And then fuel management policies is a big part of this. So this is where you kind of get into the environmental human kind of behavioral nexus. And then in the kind of ignition events perspective, there's been a lot of work to try to understand really how power line failures have contributed to wildfire ignition. But again, these are really spatially variable where you are having lightning events, where your power lines are. So this is here a map of the power lines for kind of a region, Carbondale, Aspen, Glenwood Springs region in Colorado. Also, human activity is quite policy specific. So thinking about burn bans and who is initiating those processes to put those in place. So these are a little bit more variable, and so there's not as much of a consistent signal in terms of how they are changing. So all of this is coming from a Western-wide US perspective. And one of the things that we really want to acknowledge is that when we say things like fires are getting worse across the Western US, that gives us a sense of our context, but really at the local scale, it can be quite difficult to plan for building resilience based on something that is a statement made about the Western US broadly. So now I want to think about community scale wildfire risk and what we can do as Western Water Assessment to support these community scale assessments. Now, why are these assessments so important? As I kind of alluded to earlier, wildfire risk vary at a very local scale. So context-specific information is really important to build robust resiliency planning. And how communities are able to build resilience really depends on a combination of how of their capacity, but also their environmental and behavioral risks. And so I think that our assessments can really help us to understand these risks and also understand how we might be able to build capacity across a network of communities. So at Western Water Assessment, we have a lot of tools and a deep kind of bench of expertise in both physical and social science. And we are utilizing kind of state-of-the-art wildfire risk models and high-resolution vegetation data to try to map out community wildfire risk. So here I'm showing, again, in the Western Water region, 6 different communities. You can see the kind of footprint of their urban areas and then the kind of different risk profiles. Deeper reds mean higher risk in this situation, and how those risk profiles vary at the scale that's essentially at the kind of urban interface scale. And if we pair, this information, so thinking about geography, wildfire risk, and vegetation data, we can understand the context of local risk, and then assess the kind of relative risk of different members across our network. So in a network like Mountain Towns 2030, we could work to assess the entire group of or communities within the network, and then try to understand how we can build capacity through partnerships between those communities. So I'll show here just a couple of community-specific risk profiles just to give you kind of a sample amongst these communities, and then kind of broaden out a little bit and think about how we group communities together to come up with these potentially communities of practice for resilience building. So if we start with a place like Estes Park, this is a risk profile. Essentially, this curve lets you know how much of your land surface area falls in these different risk categories. On the left-hand figure being low fire risk, and the right-hand side of the figure being your high fire risk. For reference, we put the Western U.S. in a black line, and we put the areas where the 1,000 largest fires across the West occurs as kind of our extreme end member. So if you look at a place like Estes Park, this line falls to the right of the Western U.S., so it's got increased risk, wildfire risk relative to the rest of the Western U.S. And so we might say in Estes Park, they might need to be doing more kind of resilience planning than kind of the Western U.S. more broadly because they have more acute risk. We could also think about other places where the geography and the vegetation mean they have decreased risk relative to the rest of the Western U.S. And so while there isn't no risk here, they still do have wildfire risk. Their unique local context means that their kind of risk profile line is falling to the left of the rest of the Western U.S., meaning their risk is kind of lower relative to maybe some of these other communities. So we can take this approach and we can broaden it out to several different communities and maybe make some comparisons, make these risk profiles and say, okay, here's the risk profile of the entirety of the Western U.S. Here's the 1,000 largest fires. Some communities like Park City, again, have these high risk relative to the Western U.S. Some have extremely high wildfire risk, like Sheridan, Wyoming. You can see the percentage of their land area that is in this high risk category is quite large. And so this might be a community that we target and say, hey, your risk is quite acute. We should really think about this resilience planning in a really concerted effort. And again, some communities will have less wildfire risk. And so then we can think about, what are the relative needs of communities across a network? And to kind of even further explore, what does this look like when you have a network of, let's say, 20 or 30 or 50 communities? If we compare all the communities, all these urban areas across the Western Water Assessment region, then we start to get a snapshot of how can we kind of have like communities with similar risk profiles working together. And this is just one component of building networks. So thinking like maybe Boulder and Sheridan and Eagle Mountain South can work together because, hey, we have similar wildfire risk profiles at a very localized scale. And maybe we can group communities like Canyon City and Durango and Park City because maybe they're not at the highest end of risk, but they also have they have a pretty high to moderate wildfire risk. Maybe they can work together to build capacity and build planning together. So this is just one of kind of our sort of proposed methodologies for how we might like link communities together. But really, another component of this is building networks of communities that have similar kind of social and infrastructural contexts. So before I pass things off to Katie, I just want to add this kind of one final pitch about our technical expertise to support resilience. Um, we build assessments that leverage local context and we pair that with high quality data. So that includes, so for this example, Grand Junction, we can include some geographic information, where they are located relative to rivers and roads and infrastructural components that lead to their different profiles for wildfire risk. We can think about wildfire risk modeling. So where is vegetation and wildfire most likely to occur? We can overlay that on the geographic information. We can also think about burn history. So where have fires occurred? When have they occurred? And what was the community response to those burns? And can we learn from those lessons? And what I believe to be the most important part of this is taking this technical guidance and then informing the next steps of the resilience building. And that is what Katie is going to talk about now. So I will pass it along to her. And Katie, you can let me know when you want me to advance slides.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, Nels. I really appreciate it. Hi, folks. I'm Katie Clifford. I'm Western Water and Assessments social sciences lead. So I think a lot about building resilience, the kind of community action and strategies we take in response to the type of climate information and risk that Nels shared. And today I'm going to be thinking about that, particularly in the context of wildfire risk and with mountain towns. Okay, slide. So we can go back to this resilience framework. Again, that came from the US Climate Resilience Toolkit. This can work for any type of hazard, but thus far, Nels has done a really nice job laying a foundation of understanding local risk, what factors go into it, understanding exposure at the local community and risk. And slide, please. The one additional component we can think about in completing those first steps in the process is integrating community vulnerabilities into understanding that local risk. So who is most at risk in a community, right? There's a number of reasons that vulnerability isn't spread equally across a community, and you want to know where vulnerable communities are, or communities that might need special types of assistance or consideration. So here I show two pictures of groups that have mobility challenges. This is something that is an important feature when we're thinking about hazard planning, particularly for a fast onset hazard like wildfire, where you might need to evacuate quickly or move quickly. So we see, moving large numbers of school children, not an easy situation. Similarly, nursing homes. So we can think about these mobilized communities. This also could be the case with folks who don't have cars and rely on public transit, people who are in hospitals, jails. These are all, special kind of communities that might need special consideration. Other factors that you might want to be thinking about in coming up with your local risk assessment might be thinking about communities, how resources are distributed across a community, thinking about those who might not get automated warnings. We work in some areas in the rural West where there is not a high adoption of cell phones, or, where people might have language barriers to understand those types of warnings. And then a key thing, and especially mountain towns, is thinking about how to work with visitors and part-time residents who might not have the same kind of local knowledge, understanding around both risky behaviors and the type of evacuation and safe kind of behaviors of what to do beforehand and during a wildfire. So those are kind of special considerations as well. And combined with what Nels said, this can give you a fuller picture of the localized risk, and then be a next step for the next component. Slide. Great. So here, the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the second half of this, which really focuses on planning and implementing resilience strategies, right? So investigating options and then working to prioritize those. Slide. So this first step, investigating options, is referring to, what types of strategies are available to mitigate local wildfire risk. And some of the easiest actions to take are ones by motivated individuals. I'm sure you all have some of these folks in your community, right? People who are already motivated, who already understand the risk and are wanting to take action. And these types of individual actions can both really decrease risk for an individual household, and if there's enough of it, there can be, a swell to add up to a larger risk mitigation on a community level. So here's two examples. There's many individual ones. I'm just featuring kind of some examples at different scales. So first, we see defensible space. This is largely focused on removing fuels and landscaping decisions away from the household, because we know that that is what is most likely to lead to an ignition. So going through defensible space and having individuals really rework their property so that their homes have that space around them, that boundary. And another is hardening homes. Here, we see an example of a metal roof, which is less flammable than other roofing materials. And these are two examples, again, of many types of activities that an individual could do. And harnessing the energy of motivated community members is great, but building resilience will require work across different scales. So slide. So the next one I'm looking at, we can think about our community engaged actions and actions at the community scale. These are still more in the voluntary opting into type of activities. And especially, this is especially important to think at community scale for something like wildfire, where the decisions your neighbor makes directly impacts your, hazard. You could totally have done everything on your individual home, and if your neighbors have tons of fuel and, all the way around you, your risk is still going to be really high. So, here's a number of activities that could be sponsored at a community level that could help spur individual action or take a bigger element on some of these mitigation activities. So one popular tool is to sponsor specific assessments, building on what Nell said and even going down to a finer scale of individual households or neighborhoods. This can be highly motivating. There's social science that's shown particularly what happens if you look at a neighborhood and kind of peer pressuring, harnessing that kind of energy around if certain homes aren't taking action, but just having a greater sense at that really fine scale can be helpful. Another is outreach, and really important for mountain towns and this type of community is thinking both to full-time residents and part-time residents. There's in places where people spend a season or seasonal time, they might not have the same understanding of really how fire prone these landscapes can be compared to other regions of the US. So this could be including mitigation checklists, demonstrations of what does like a, best practices look like that they could adopt. And then other examples include sponsoring something like community chipper days. This is done in a lot of mountain communities that help remove fuels from individuals' property, or things like prescribed burns and thinning. Obviously, that's more at a government or kind of organizational scale. Slide. And so far, all the things we've discussed have been somewhat voluntary, but an important piece of this puzzle is at the policy level. And this is somewhat of a lightning rod, but very effective in reducing wildfire risk. So it's important to discuss. So other strategies that we've talked about might require a lot of financial capital, money, right? Forms of social capital, relying on neighbors and community activity. These policy changes require a lot of political capital because they can be very contentious and might, have community pushback, but also represent some ability to really reduce wildfire risk. So first, when thinking about zoning, communities, often cities or counties, can use land use planning and zoning to reduce development in high-risk areas that will increase the overall risk for a community. So not building new homes in areas that are highly exposed and high risk is one way that communities can take action. So here we see an example from Pierce County in Washington, and they have a number of different zones. And the bottom one, the light green, says long-term non-buildable areas. So removing certain areas that are very high risk, that would be hard to fight fires in, and particular ones that haven't already been built in, can be one way a community can work to maintain or decrease risk. A second is building codes. This is another tool governments can take. Again, this could be at the city, county level, or a state like Colorado just has come out with one statewide. And this requires different types of materials or design elements in high risk or WUI, wildland urban interface areas. This can be very effective, and it's important to think about how this intersects with other housing goals, as it can be challenging around goals around density, affordability, and speed of development. But very important tools to be considering. Slide. And one way that Western Water can help at this stage is to bring technical expertise to communities to expand the potential strategies they consider, right? So here's an example of a social science research paper that developed community wildfire archetypes, which are these overarching patterns of community characteristics found in wildfire-prone areas. In other words, they created subgroups saying these are the, 4 to 6 different types of communities in the WUI that and how their social characteristics different than what Nels was saying, grouping them by physical characteristics. These social characteristics are similar and different, and how that might shape what kinds of actions they can take. Slide. So, I pulled out 2 that I thought might be most relevant for mountain towns. One is high amenity, high resource, right? This is an example like a ski community, resort community. The paper says Leavenworth is an example, but and then the other is rural lifestyle, which might be some of the mountain town communities or might be adjacent communities that you're working with and alongside in some of these wildfire mitigation goals. And the reason this type of work of bringing these kind of research frameworks or expanded understandings might be helpful is it can help communities not recreate the wheel, right? You guys are all doing a lot of work. The idea of adding significantly more to your plates, I'm sure, is overwhelming. And here we can look at communities that have similar profiles and say, okay, what risks did they identify and which resilience strategies worked in these specific types of contexts? That can be a really great starting place to save some legwork. A second reason something like this could be helpful is for peer-to-peer learning, using this as a way to separate out in groups. So maybe Mountain Town 2020 wants to separate using different types of archetypes that for both understanding what previous communities have done, but also peer-to-peer learning. Okay, what are communities who are in the same place developing processes, strategies, what's on their plate, what are they doing, and working in real time in a facilitated process that Western Water could help with. Slide. And then another place, this is kind of the last one I want to talk about is when we're identifying actions, is how important it is to utilize local knowledge. We can do a lot bringing in technical expertise, leveraging peer-to-peer learning from other communities that are doing this work, what worked best in a town like mine. But we all know that every community is different. And, here's a picture of community workshops we did in a community in Wyoming that was worried about flooding, where we asked long-term residents to come up with strategies themselves. And engaging the community not only gets really good ideas, ones that weren't, ones that we had on the list that we were coming in with, but it's also critical for buy-in in a process. So doing a process like this helps the community feel ownership. It helps the process feel transparent, right? Where did these strategies come from? What kind of process, is this like some outside group coming in with these ideas, or is this coming from local community members themselves? And it can help drive momentum on an important issue that often gets pushed down by urgent ones. We talk with communities all the time who say, I know this hazard mitigation work is really important, but urgent, issues come in and push it down on my to-do list so that some of these really important longer term priorities get displaced by just, figurative fires. So that's another reason that this can be a helpful process. Slide. So the last phase here is on prioritization. We generate a bunch of ideas, we look at them, but then to be strategic, we all have limited, resources, time, etc. Thinking about how do we prioritize amongst many strategies to think about which ones are most strategic to take, in near term and long term, which ones do we want to invest in? And this can be based on things like metrics like resilience impact, the cost, any kind of additional environmental impacts we should be thinking about, and how implementable, how feasible they are to implement. Slide. So one of the ways Western Water plays a role in building community resilience is through convening communities and facilitating a process that can help them not only identify actions, but prioritize them. We know every community, again, has the limited time, political capital, capacity. So it's important to prioritize which actions to take first and which to focus energy on. So here we are at another community workshop in a Colorado mountain town, helping them plan for drought. And we partnered with a leader to pull together folks from across a community, those that are often in different departments that get siloed, right? In wildfire, we know land use planning is important. We also know, parks and open space. It might also be water and facilities. All of these folks might not be in regular conversation or have ever been in conversation on a specific hazard. So pulling them together and inviting community members with deep local expertise together to go through a process where we identify actions and then prioritize which would be most useful. And at the end of 2 days, they had a long list of different types of actions they could take and an agreed upon prioritized top tier. And these workshops are able to be a catalyst for action on hazard mitigation. We facilitated difficult discussions and envisioned strategies, and the communities left with to-do lists of their own making, which years later led to significant reduction in risk. This type of process can help fight the overwhelm of starting, right? There is so much to do, so many places to do it. Where do we even start? And this kind of convening process can be a catalyst for action. And in wildfire, that could be a springboard to doing a more formalized process like community wildfire protection plan, becoming a firewise community, or if those are already done, this can be a moment to reassess and reprioritize to keep momentum going. So this is just an example of the ways Western Water, one of the services Western Water Assessment can provide to mountain towns. Then I'll pass it back to you, Nels.
Perfect. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I just have one kind of wrap-up slide, and then we can answer some questions and have a nice discussion with the folks on the call. At Western Water, we're really looking forward to this partnership with Mountain Towns 2030. We've been working with Chris, and we really believe that we can build partnerships across the network to understand how our work can support resilience and synergize with the goals of the Mountain Towns 2030 network. The second point, we're currently funded to work in communities across the region, and we can leverage that funding to really support resilience building. I put an asterisk there because, as you all are aware, there is a lot of uncertainty in kind of federally funded research these days. And so, despite that asterisk, we support resilience building, and maybe we can be a resilient organization in ourselves. And we hope to keep doing this really important work. And we would love to build partnerships with communities who would benefit from the kind of service and analysis that we provide. So feel free to reach out to either Katie and I or Chris, and he can connect us. But with that, I think we can wrap things up and take any questions. Thanks.
Nels and Katie, thank you so much. That was really informative and really important for everyone to hear. So thank you. Seth, do you want to take a couple questions?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'll just, Caitlin Simpson just made the point that I don't think we made quite clear about in the beginning of our talk, introducing Western Water Assessment. So Western Water Assessment is funded through a NOAA program called the Climate Adaptation Partnership Program. And that program, it's a relatively small program within NOAA, but it funds 13 organizations like ourselves that work regionally around the country. So just wanted to make, thanks for that clarification, Caitlin. And John asked a question about our ability to develop assessments for communities. And he specifically asked, how small can you go in evaluating a town's risk? Specifically curious about Ridgeway and Ouray County, Colorado. And in terms of the size of community, we can provide, very location specific climate and wildfire risk information, really for any size community. So we could certainly, in that example, we could certainly provide information about towns as small as Ridgeway and Ouray.
Yeah.
If you had anything else to add, Nels.
Yeah, I can hop in there just a little bit. We're using, we're within our network of colleagues, not just within Western Water Assessment, but we're really linked into a number of different groups and Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service. We work with folks at NOAA, and we are always keeping our eyes out for kind of better, more high quality assessments of things like wildfire risk and the many factors, as I kind of pointed out in the talk, that go into wildfire risk assessments. And so, yeah, just echoing what Seth said, like really any of the communities across the Western U.S., we can provide assessments and really drill down into community specific context. And I think a big part of that as well is, we as a team can travel out to locations and engage in these community kind of developed workshops, and part of that can be leveraging local knowledge to build and support these risk assessments. So from a data perspective, we have access and experience with the kind of state-of-the-art risk assessment data, but we also can bolster any of these risk assessments with our kind of more localized approach as well, which I think is really important to kind of include in that description.
Thanks, Nels. I thought it was really interesting to hear about how you could work with communities on a collaborative level, kind of pairing up communities or grouping communities that are facing the same level of risk. And I think that's very much aligned with kind of what we're doing on a number of things. But I would love to continue this conversation at the summit in Breckenridge to really kind of dig down a little bit deeper and to give everybody kind of access to you all on a one-to-one level, because obviously wildfire resilience is top of mind for everybody, and it's something that we want to be talking about more. So yeah, I just think that whole collaborative approach is really, really important and valuable.
Thank you, Chris. And yes, we plan to be there. And, this could be almost our preview or teaser. If the things that we're talking about, you're welcome to send us an email and we could chat. But we also we're really excited to participate in October. So that could be a place, in person, we could have coffee, go on a walk, whatever, hopefully connect on that too.
Great.
A few more questions have cropped up. Julia asks, do you do any engagement work with utilities, or would you be able to under this partnership? That's a great question. So historically, we haven't worked with a lot of electrical utilities. We do have, we have partnered with utilities focusing more on water supply for decades at this point. And those are absolutely organizations we would be willing to work with. And in fact, in thinking about wildfire resilience over the past 6 months or so, we really have started to investigate and think about ways that we could more directly work with electrical utilities. For example, I know some electrical utilities like Pacific Corp that provides power for a lot of the Intermountain West is doing more work with wildfire resilience following some of the wildfires in 2020. I don't know if Nels or Katie has anything to add there.
Yeah, I'll also hop in to say that, this is something we have been talking about, because even on the resilience side of things, we're seeing, particularly in certain regions, and I think it'll be growing across the whole West, but certain states are seeing more and more preventative blackouts. And what this means for resilience and planning around how, um, certain states like California have seen a lot of these preventative blackouts, or things like fast trip ones where they have deployed sensors that do a really quick one. Um, Other states, being Colorado, where we've seen much fewer of these, but there has also been less kind of guidelines and guardrails about how do we do this so that we can, that it doesn't disrupt life, put people at risk. There's people who rely with medical devices on electricity, et cetera. And so I think on both sides, we could both on preventing wildfire, but also thinking about some of the resilience impacts of how utilities take action around here is a place we could be plugging in as well.
Maya asks or makes the comment, there could be opportunity to partner on community wildfire protection planning and or taking them one step further with Western water assessment. The network planning seems like the key difference between your work and the community wildfire protection planning. I would say, yeah, absolutely. That is something we'd be willing to work with in communities and partner on projects like that.
Yeah, and I could just quickly say that add to that is, if a community has an existing wildfire protection plan, that is great, and we don't have to always start our assessments like at ground zero. It's all about leveraging the work that's already been done and coming. If a community has already been thinking about this planning, we think that's amazing, and we would be happy to kind of think about how we can both use our Western water expertise to bolster that planning or that resilience if that feels like it's needed. And then also, yeah, from this community network perspective, can we do take some of these existing planning and really kind of bolster our Western wide network of communities to be more resilient?
Steve asks, is Western Water Assessment working with the Colorado Wildfire Ready Watersheds program? Nels or Katie, do you know? I don't believe we are.
Okay. We are not currently working with them, but we do work across a network of watershed managers who are working within that framework or structure. So we are not directly connected to that organization, no, but we are aware of their work, and we have a kind of deep experience working on the kind of watershed scale as well, because we know that while communities have these urban boundaries and want to plan about where people live, the watershed component is also really important because wildfire can have all these linked hazards, thinking about water quality and flooding as well. So that's something we're definitely tuned into and can be part of this kind of assessment approach, is not just thinking about your community, but the context of your community, like a watershed.
Are neighborhoods or communities using these risk assessments and actions taken to work with insurance providers? So thus far, like we have not worked with communities and then directly worked with insurance providers. I think that this is I think, a challenge that a lot of homeowners are facing because I'll just use some Utah examples. That's where I'm based out of. There's many, dozens of companies that provide homeowners insurance. One insurance company might significantly, rate hike a homeowner because they live in a wildfire prone area and they're reevaluating those rates. They may even get their insurance canceled, but they can go to another insurance provider potentially to find a quote. And some of these discrepancies really have to do with the fact that insurance companies are using private consulting firms that are developing these wildfire risk assessments, and they vary with the kind of information that they're using. I know here in Utah, there was a law passed by the state legislature last year that is requiring insurance companies to use wildfire risk assessment maps that are created by one of the state agencies here. And that's really to provide some uniformity in some of this information. So I'm just bringing up that point there because I think that there are likely some opportunities to work with insurance companies. I think there's a lot of challenges there with doing that, but I think that there are opportunities, and we're seeing some larger organizations like states trying to get into that space. So there's a little more uniformity in some of the decision making on insurance policies in wildfire.
The other note I'll say is that becoming a Firewise, right? You can do a CWPP and then separately is becoming a Firewise community, which is kind of a more structured process. Some insurance companies do reduce rate for doing that. So if you become a Firewise community, it depends on insurance agencies, but I think USAA and the Colorado Fair, or not Colorado, California Fair, like there's a few, but it is by insurance agency, but Firewise is a way, and this assessment could be linked in with that, but this also could be something, we discuss more of how you might want to take assessments like Nels did to an insurance company to try to demonstrate.
And just someone made the note that they weren't sure if that bill I was talking about in Utah actually passed, and that may be right. I may have misspoke about that, but it's something that was considered anyway. So there are larger organizations like states trying to jump into this sphere. Kieran asks, I think Katie mentioned that convening and community planning can lead to reduced risk in a community. I'm curious how that reduction in risk is measured. Do you reassess after community planning is completed? And if so, what measures indicate a reduction in risk based on that reassessment?
I'll jump in and then, can pass. So the example I was talking about was a process, but we were focusing on drought, so a little bit different in how we assess. We did go back to communities and we did, repeated interviews to understand what types of actions were taken. In this case, the community, through being part of this process, realized that a certain kind of development or portion of their community was relying only on groundwater, and they actually developed a secondary water source for that community. So that was a pretty kind of concrete action that they took around drought, right, to make sure that the water reliability for everyone in their community. So that was a way that we were saying that was a concrete action that resulted in reduced risk because of redundancy. I will pass it to Nels. I'm not sure if, there's always a question of like, how long do you wait to measure? It's a really good question of what metrics do you use? We tend to often let the communities decide what metrics they think are important and evaluate it based on that, rather than coming in and kind of saying like, you did a good job, you didn't do a good job. No one wants that. But I do think this question of measurement is really important.
Yeah, I can just kind of like briefly follow up on that. And, the idea of risk really, it includes the kind of action and the planning that happens at the community scale and the measures that are taken to kind of build resilience. And so, part of the assessment, as we alluded to, there's the kind of technical physical science like modeling perspective, and that can give us an initial assessment of risk. But the reassessment process, I think, really is part of this process of engaging with a community, re-engaging after a plan is made and seeing what progress was made. Sometimes this engagement processing also includes, we do this prioritization and we do this planning at a community engagement level. And then when we revisit, we might find that there were challenges to that prioritization or there were strengths to it. And so reassessing after kind of like how, like Katie alluded to, how long do you wait until coming back? I think for Western Water, we've really understood through years of experience with this process that it's really about revisiting, kind of continuing this engagement with this process. These things are not a one-off, like we'll make a plan, we'll try to implement it, and then see, like down the road, see if it worked. It's really a continual process of re-engagement and then assessing risk based on, again, as Katie mentioned, these kind of community-based metrics of like, wow, what is the kind of perception of risk at a community scale? What is the perception of preparedness and resilience? And part of that process is, thinking through these scenarios. What if a fire were to occur in your community? How would your community react? And many of those assessments of resilience can come from recognizing that going through this process, more people in the community and key people in the community are able to say, this is the plan, this is how we would react to wildfire, these are the measures that we have in place. So I think that's it. As Katie mentioned, it's a really important question, and a part of our process is understanding what are those metrics.
And then finally, Sherry provides two good ways to finish here. One, she actually clarified the clarification that the bill I was talking about in Utah, House Bill 48, did pass in Utah, and the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is working on wildfire risk maps and rules to go along with that will come into effect at the beginning of 2026. And finally, I think this is probably a great way to end the meeting, which Chris can jump in with. What are the details of the Mountain Towns 2030 Summit in October?
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, Sherry, great question. This summit will be taking place in Breckenridge on October 7th and 8th. All the details are on our website at mt2030.org. If you're not on our mailing list, you can go on our website and just add your name to the list, and you'll be automatically added to all the information that we send out about the summit. Or feel free to email me if you need anything specific. We'll be releasing an agenda really soon. But as we just talked about, we're going to have a lot of workshops, one of them being with Nels and Seth and Katie to talk about this resilience planning aspect. So please come to Breckenridge in October. It's going to be a great event. Couple more things that I just wanted to make everybody aware of. We are going to continue this conversation too on our online network. So if you're not a member of our community online, just go to our website and ask for an invitation. But if you have any other questions or want to discuss this some more, the online community is a perfect place to do that. So that's one thing. Secondly, on August 27th, we're going to be having an in-person event. Location is going to be announced pretty soon, but somewhere in Colorado, designed for building code professionals. And this goes back to what Katie had mentioned earlier. Colorado is coming out with a new wildfire resilience building code. And we're going to be talking about that as well. So stay tuned for an invitation to that for your building code team. And we'll be meeting in person for a one-day event. And thirdly, we're going to be meeting again next week on another webinar, and the topic's going to be about funding. Obviously, as Nels had mentioned earlier, there's a lot of uncertainty around how to get projects funded. We're going to be having a webinar with the Colorado Energy Office about their new Impact Accelerator program. So if you haven't registered already, you'll be seeing an email from us soon about that. But that's on Tuesday, June 24th, so next week. That's a lot. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, reach out to me. I'll be sharing the recording and the deck with all of you so you can watch it again or share it. And feel free to reach out to Nels and Katie as well directly for more information or opportunities on how to partner with them. So Nels, Seth, Katie, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you all for being here today too. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.